Okay, Bismillah wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulullah amma ba'd. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. This is Abu Ayyub with Simply Serious Studios and also a member of MAP, Muslim Apologetics Podcast. And today I'm with Ijaz Ahmed, who is a part of Blogging Theology, Calling Christians, MDI, the Muslim Debate Initiative, and also MAP, Muslim Apologetics Podcast. So today we're going to be chatting about your recent debate that you had. Assalamu alaikum, Ijaz.
Walaikum assalam, brother Abu Ayyub. It's good to hear from you again.
Yeah, long time no see or hear.
Yeah, man. True.
All right, so mashallah, you had a debate recently in Toronto, right?
Yep.
Okay, and so tell us exactly what led up to this debate. Why did you do it? What was the motivation behind this? And just give us an overall summary of what took place.
Well, there has been some confusion because I had told people I was no longer debating, that I was going to take a break, get my health on track, inshallah. But that didn't seem to pan out, yeah. So basically what happened is that every year I've had a discussion with Alex at a center called the P4E or Paradise Forever. And that's a discussion we have with himself and other Christians and Muslims on a year-to-year basis. And this year I had the same discussion with him in the summer months. And I promised him, Alex, when I return to Toronto, we'll have a debate or a dialogue, right? He said, definitely. So it turned out I had to return to Toronto this year again before the end of the year. And so because I had promised I would debate you the next time I return, that's basically how the debate happened.
MashaAllah. Okay, so in the debate itself, can you give us just a summary of what it was? What was the subject matter?
Okay, so the topic, technically speaking, was supposed to be the Quran, the New Testament, and the Old Testament. And it's supposed to be a continuation of the discussion I had with Alex and the other Christians at the P4E Center. But we've titled it Navigating Differences in Theology because that's what these differences in the books demonstrate, that we have fundamentally different beliefs about God and different beliefs about Scripture. So that was the larger scope of the topic, but the more direct scope of the topic was the relationship of the Quran to the Old and New Testament. A lot of people, for example, I believe Dr. James White, you recently had an interaction with him, don't believe that the Quran interacts meaningfully with Christian beliefs. And so this dialogue I had with Alex was to demonstrate that the Quran had an intimate knowledge of the Old and New Testaments together. And so that was pretty much the basis for the topic. On his behalf, he wanted to speak about what kind of scripture did the Jews and Christians have? What kind of scripture does the Quran interact with? Was there a Torah in Medina? Can we call it the Medinan Torah? And so basically, that was the topic. How does the Quran interact with the Old and New Testaments?
Okay, mashallah. Yeah, I mean, I see that now the argument, this particular argument isn't really being able to be used as much as it used to be beforehand. A lot of the Muslims, mashallah, they're tackling this. That's the actual claim that the Quran doesn't address Christian beliefs properly. And inshallah, I'll be doing a lecture on this shortly as well. But in relation to your debate, you had one topic that you brought up about Deuteronomy 6:5. Where exactly did you get this argument from? And can you explain it to us?
All right. So basically, in the summer months, when I told Alex I would return, that the next time I return, I would have a dialogue or debate with him, I didn't know it would be 2 months afterwards. So in between the time I left and I returned to Toronto, I hadn't read anything new. And so in the lead up to the debate, he told me, let's have a continuation of what we did in the summer months. But he's going to send me a summary of what we did in the summer months. He sent it to me, and I didn't get a chance to read it. I felt really badly. So I told him, here's what. You've obviously listened to the audio recording of what we did in the summer months. You've sent me a document. I didn't get the chance to read it. So, I didn't have the opportunity to read anything new. So I'm not going to bring any new information. Sorry, I'm not going to read any new books or journals or research to come into the dialogue or debate with. So I think that's pretty much the background. And leading up to the dialogue itself, I because I couldn't read anything new, the only thing I was left with was the Bible, right? That was something I had already read. He had already read it. And I thought to myself, okay, he's going to ask me a lot about the Quran differing with the Old Testament, the Quran's claims about the people of the book, the Quran's claims about Bani Israel. So he would focus mostly on the Old Testament, as he has had in our previous dialogues. And so I told myself, I've never studied the Old Testament. I don't study it at any great depth. I think even you know that. I focus mainly on the New Testament and the Quran. However, a couple of days before I left for Toronto, I realized that I could actually kill two birds with one stone. I don't actually have to, because I couldn't read anything new, and because I hadn't read anything new, I was familiar with one area of textual criticism where the New Testament contradicts the Old Testament. So whenever the New Testament quotes the Old Testament, it always gets it wrong. If it references it, it always gets the reference wrong. So the argument I intended to make was to demonstrate where the Old Testament and the New Testament disagreed, because if the New Testament is quoting the Old Testament, it should get it right, right?
Yeah.
And on my way over to Toronto, it occurred to me, wait a second. Of course, there are many variants I could bring up, many contradictions between the old and the new when it pertains to the quotes. But on my way to Toronto, I realized, wait a second, I wonder if Jesus ever misquotes the Old Testament. That would be a weird thing, right? I mean, you think so?
Yeah.
Jesus misquotes in the Old Testament. One, if you believe he's God. Two, if you believe he's a prophet. And thirdly, if you believe he was quoted in the Old Testament that we have today, then there shouldn't be any differences. And so it occurred to me, well, why don't you go to the most extreme? Why don't you see if he misquoted the Shema? That's an impossibility. I mean, you've read the Shema, you don't see any differences. Check it again, see what turns up. It so happens when I looked at the Gospel of Matthew and I read, now this, just so you know, a lot of people don't know that the Shema is not just one verse. It's 3 verses in total. There are different names for each verse, but generally they're referred to as the Shema. And the Shema is here, O Israel, your Lord thy God is one. And the verse right after that actually goes into the conditions for fulfilling faith. So like how we have conditions for the 5 pillars of Islam, how we have the 6 articles of faith. But here Jesus gives 3 conditions for fulfilling the Shema, the conditions of the Shema. And I told myself, okay, let me see what he's actually quoting. I went to the Old Testament and realized, well, wait a second, there's a contradiction here. It's not saying the exact same thing, and he's supposed to be quoting it. And so I checked another Old Testament I had, same problem. And then I checked the Gospel of Mark, I believe, and I realized that the problem was even greater there. He added a different condition to it. So at the end of the day, I began to realize, well, wait a second, none of these references add up. None of these quotes make sense. They all contradict each other. They're not consistent. You would at least expect 2 of them to match, but there's never a case where both of them match of the 4 sources that I looked at. And that's what I told myself. Well, obviously Alex has read the Old Testament. Obviously he's read the New Testament. This will not be something new to him. He knows the Shema. He knows the conditions for the Shema. And so I thought I would bring something that he could relate to. The underscoring argument being, if the Shema could be changed, then anything could be changed. The floodgates are opened at that point.
Okay, yeah, mashallah. And what they'll assume at the same time is even if you have a good argument or response to this, that they're going to then, what I've seen is that they're saying, well, this must be a Jewish argument. Well, this isn't, this, you didn't bring this by from yourself, but you must have brought it from some rabbi, some apologist, a Jewish apologist today. So did your argument itself, you've basically laid that out of actually how did you come up to this conclusion, and you did it yourself. You did the groundwork yourself to reach that conclusion. But what would you be your response to those people that use it as a counter argument to you, which I don't think is correct, that, oh, this is just a Jewish argument against Christianity?
Well, I won't say a lot of people. Only one person really brought this up to me, and that's because the night before the debate, I actually spent it with a counter-missionary rabbi. So the coincidence there, right? Basically, Rabbi Michael Skobach from JewsForJudaism.ca. I had always liked his videos, always watched the good work that he had done, and I had resolved to meet him earlier this year. But my schedule did not line up with his at all. It was really hectic. And it so happened that on the second return trip this year, I happened to, the schedule opened up, and usually the night before a dialogue or an event, I'm at home, I'm resting because I need my rest for private reasons, as you well know, Brother Abu Ayub.
Mm.
And I decided to take a risk, and I told myself it's a dialogue. I've already got these arguments down. I've already written them out. I'm good to go. Let me go and spend some time with the rabbi and see what he's up to, get to know him, learn from him a little bit. And nothing he mentioned in that class made its way into the debate, the dialogue. Nothing he mentioned. I just wanted to meet the guy. But yes, literally all of the groundwork was done by myself. In fact, this might surprise some people, but I actually showed some of the research for like 2 minutes to the rabbi, and he was interested because he does not believe in the Greek Septuagint, right? So that's the Old Testament that most Christians believe in. That's the Old Testament that most Christians believe Jesus would have believed in, the Greek Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament. The rabbi does not accept the Greek Old Testament. He accepts the Masoretic text from 400 years after the Quran, which is in the year 1000 CE, Codex Leningrad, I believe. I could be wrong, but I think it's Codex Leningrad. And so he believes in something 400 years from the Quran. Of course, he believes that there's an earlier tradition that led up to that time disparity. But in any case, he does not believe in the Greek Septuagint. So he was interested in seeing that the Greek Septuagint contradicts the Greek New Testament. You would think it's the same language, quoting from the same tradition, being contemporaneous to each other, that the quote should be the same, and it isn't. In any case, no, it's not taken from anyone. And I did know that, I think I heard not too long ago that Dr. James White had mentioned that maybe perhaps, I think he was referring to Brother Zakir Hussein. He mentioned that some people in London were taking the arguments of rabbis and Jews and using it in debates with Christians. And I just think that that is an unfair comment, to be honest. I hope that clarifies. If I took any.
At the end of the day, just because two people have the same argument doesn't mean that one must have taken from the other. We can all reach the same conclusions.
I agree on that.
And that appears to be, I mean, that's the core of James White's argument, is that, well, if you let the text speak for itself, then it's going to reach this particular conclusion of Jesus being God. That's what his argument is. So he's actually he's trying to call towards previous scholars, which usually Protestant Christianity doesn't want to do. Or now we're moving towards actually your statement itself in the debate. So you had your opening statement. Did anybody have any criticisms against that opening statement? Do they think that you were taking arguments from other people, or copying, cutting and pasting like some people that did previously? Don't want to mention names, but Jonathan McClatchy. So did you do a cut and paste job like other people have done, or was this your original writing and your effort?
Okay. Well, let me just begin by saying I have a great and deep respect for the incredible Jonathan McClatchy. I believe the guy is highly, highly incredible.
You sound like Trump there. He's the greatest. Incredible. The best.
You're just gonna Google what the word incredible means, right?
Yeah.
No, I didn't do a Jonathan McClatchy actually. So I wrote, in writing my opening statement, I usually write it like weeks beforehand. I didn't have weeks to prepare for this dialogue/debate. It was just like a matter of 1 week agreed, the next week you had it. And I actually began by writing points out on my phone. There's this app called Google Keep, right? So I wrote out some points. And what I usually do is I read the points back to myself and try to counter argue against them. And it spends like hours in my head refuting myself. And basically my opening statement was mostly written the day of the event. And you can search it. You can look it up online. You can copy paste from it, do a Google reverse search. You're not going to find a single sentence except the quotes from the New Testament and the Old Testament online. It's all my original research.
That's plagiarism. That's it.
You caught me. I'm guilty. I'm Jonathan McClatchy. But in any case, it was honest to God. Sit down, reading, comparing, contrasting. I don't like using the arguments of others, and I've always resolved, since my first stage debate dialogue, to always bring something new to the table. The argument itself, I don't believe, is new. We know that there are contradictions between the New Testament and the Old Testament when it comes to the quotes, but people aren't aware to the extent that they differ. And so I think presenting it in this form is new to the people. I think even James White generally mentioned that this is what you learn at seminary level, true, but I have not seen any seminary level papers discussing how to resolve these contradictions on Deuteronomy chapter 6 verse 5 and the quotes in Matthew and Mark. I haven't seen any research on that. I looked it up after the debate to see, well, is there any research on it? Didn't say anything. So I think it's quite original in that case, yeah?
Yeah. And just to make a note here, there's a difference between, and we made an argument before where some people can reach the same conclusions of an argument due to the text, but there's a difference between that and actually repeating verbatim an argument written on an article by somebody else, and that's
on the internet.
That's what our buddy did. So even if you did copy somebody's work, I'd hope at the very least you would rewrite it a little bit and put it
it brings an interesting question, because I believe William Lane Craig is in the news right now for having plagiarized part of his PhD thesis, right? Yeah. So it doesn't surprise me that, do you know what projection is? So these Christians, man, wow, some of these Christians apologists, they project upon us quite a lot when they're guilty of the exact same thing, It's really mind-blowing.
So, well, if they got away with it, then, just imagine, then they're thinking everybody's doing it because they got away with it. So it makes them paranoid.
Yeah, well, thank God we have standards.
Yeah. All right, so back to the debate. So what was the audience like?
Well, do you want me to be honest here? I can do a Jonathan McClatchy and use Takia, but we didn't advertise this event much, if at all, mostly because it was a rushed event. I wasn't supposed to be there at that time, at that date. I was there for something else, for other things actually. Yeah. And it was just completely random, to be honest. And the date I had chosen was the middle of the week, a Thursday, technically. That is the middle of the week if you take into consideration Saturday. My maths could be wrong, don't judge me. But the point being that it's middle of the week, and I believe at this point, the weather was changing from summer to winter pretty quickly. And so temperatures were dropping, and I believe on this night it was like 1 degrees Celsius or something. So we were actually expecting snow that night, and it was in the night. It was the middle of the week. We didn't advertise it much. So I thought to myself, if 5 people show up, that's it, right? I'm happy with 5 people. It turned out to be 130 or something in that area. I was actually surprised. The hall was packed with people. The section that we had set up and that put out chairs, I'm thinking to myself, wait a second, why are there all these chairs? They're not going to be that large amount of people. And when I sit down, and I'm still doing some final edits on my slides, final edits on my writing, and I look up, and the debate hasn't started as yet. They're trying to get the projector running and stuff. And I look up and I see that it's filled. Now, I didn't prepare for a full audience being there, right? So it was a pretty interesting experience. I mean, you think 5 people are going to show up, and then 130 plus, so I was actually quite surprised, to be honest. It's like I said, middle of the week. Winter is just about to begin. Late at night, you don't expect anyone to show up. And what shocked me was the number of sisters there, right? You're thinking, okay, they probably got kids. No offense, I hope this isn't so misogynistic. They probably got kids to see about, so, evening university or evening jobs. They're not going to be there. Probably tired from work all day. And there was a sizable amount of women in the audience. I was actually quite pleasantly surprised. So it was a really great set of diverse. The audience was really diverse. Really young brothers, mashallah, our ages and younger. And then we had I think one young 2 or 3 young babies there. One young toddler that was running around behind camera. And the crowd was really sizable, and I'm really happy with the people that turned out. Even if 1 person turned up, I would be happy, because like I said, we didn't intend to have anything. It wasn't supposed to be a big event. It was done under the radar, technically speaking, because like I said, it was a rush, last minute job. And alhamdulillah, the organizers were amazing. That's the I3 Interactive Islamic Institute with Sheikh Oster. They're doing a fantastic job there in Toronto, and it was at Cooper's Masjid, and we actually got lost on the way to Cooper's Masjid. It's a big masjid, mashallah, very big, very beautiful, very nice, well laid out. But to find it was a problem because I think it's behind some Olympic or some football stadium thing. So it's actually hidden from one direction. And so I took all that into consideration. I told myself, man, you know what, just 5 people are going to be there. Turned out to be a lot more. And to be quite honest, they actually had to find food for the people that attended. They didn't expect so many people to show up, but the masjid management, they came and they provided food and snacks for the people. I was really impressed, really happy the way that things turned out. People were really excited to hear about this topic, which was, surprising to me.
Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. I'm glad that you had a good experience and you enjoyed that, and actually that the results of it actually were more above and beyond what you expected. But okay, now that you've done this debate, here's the important question. Is this going to be your last debate? Or are you planning on doing other ones in the future? What do you got planned?
Okay, so I think as people would know, if you listen to the podcast often, or you watch what we have to do on social media, on our website, so wherever, I mentioned I was taking a break from debates actually. So usually every year I have like 1 or 2 debates, and I've been lessening and lessening the number of debates as different priorities in life have turned up. And I actually resolved not to do any debates. In fact, there was this one guy that was stalking me online. I forgot his name. It could be Claus or something. The name slips my mind at the moment. And he actually made a comment to Brother Yahya Snow that he wanted to cancel any debate that Ijaz had. I'll cancel it. And then Brother Yahya replied to him, I believe, if what I'm told is correct, how can you cancel a debate that someone's not having? Right? It's like, I'm going to boycott Coca-Cola, but Coca-Cola has stopped production. Like, that's a really timely boycott, right?
Yeah.
So, really funny guys. And so in any case, I had intended to stop debating. It's personal health reasons, as some people know. And I don't think I'll have another debate soon. I don't intend to. I mean, I have promised certain people the next time we meet, we'll have a debate. Luckily, I don't live in the same city with any of them. So that's just one thing. But inshallah, I'm looking maybe 2019, 2020, perhaps I'll jump back into the debating scene. I may have some dialogues in the next year. Allah knows best. Opportunities drop wherever they may, and it really depends on my health and my ability at that point in time. I really need to rest and use my medication and physical therapy and that kind of thing. So it's a long journey. People don't realize that a debate and a dialogue is a very serious event. You have to study, you have to learn, you have to practice, you have to prepare yourself. Then there's the logistics behind it, getting the camera, the projector, the audio correct. Then there's the editing, and then there's the producing of the video, rendering it, uploading it, sharing it. It's not just one event, you do it and it's done. There are things leading up to it, things during it, and things after it. It's a long, lengthy process. And I'm not one of those individuals interested in having a debate every other week or every other month. I'm a very private individual. And even though we operate Muslim Apologetics Podcasts, we even don't do videos here very often, right? Because we're all very busy with the things that we do on a day-to-day basis. So, it's in Allah's hands. Allah knows best. And we'll see what doors Allah opens. It all depends on what He has determined for us.
Yeah. I mean, but while that's taking place, we know that you're going to be growing and you're going to be learning more and studying under a few individuals, maybe. Well, like that rabbi, I don't know. but
studying is, I think, as you personally know, studying is going on with quite a few individuals. And James, let's just put a hint right here. James said that some of the stuff I was putting out there was seminary level arguments. So let's just leave that statement as it is. Let the audience take from that what they may. Who knows what's going on behind the scenes? Yeah.
Yeah, inshallah. So now that the debate is over with, have you seen that there's some Christian
engagement with your arguments? Have you seen any responses to it?
Well, what I have seen is that we have like over 14,000 views or more on the video at this point in time. I think a couple of days I checked, there were at least 5 or 6 different YouTube channels that uploaded it, a couple YouTube pages, sorry, a couple Facebook pages. So I looked at the comments, and the comments were really amazing. The feedback was really great. Just a point of note, I think you mentioned earlier, were there any criticisms of the argument? And yes, there were actually 2 criticisms. I'm not good with references. So, like I said, I was still editing my references while the debate area was being set up. And I miscited 2 verses, I think, one from Isaiah and one from Mark. But I do have the corrected version online on my website, CodingChristians.com, as well as on Blog and Theology. So I did notice I made 2 miscitations. And that's in the lead up to the event. It was a last minute edit. You know, I'm not as fortunate as Jonathan McClatchy to have people write my opening statement for me. So if I make 2 miscitations, I admit that completely and absolutely, because I want people to look up these references and see what I had to say. I think that was the only criticism, the only mistake I actually made. Other than that, what was the question again? I lost you completely.
So you had a couple new arguments, I think, in the debate that you had with Alex. So in those new arguments itself, have you seen any type of engagement with it and any good responses? And would you like to do a counter to their claim?
Do you want me to, if I'm being honest, I have seen some of our Christian friends try to engage with the 15-minute opening statement. And I have to say, there's nothing that has been said that would provoke me to, or would encourage me to the response out there. A lot of people, what they've done is, I think only 1 or 2 individuals have actually just, they've done a response, they've tried to do responses because of the number of views that the arguments have gotten. I mean, if you looked at the comments, a lot of the Muslim du'at and apologists commented and shared and liked the video. They really enjoyed it. I believe even Brother John Fontaine and yourself had some really pleasant comments to say about it in your video response. So I think Dr. James White in the last week, I believe. Right, so the exact same comments you made, that it was foundational, it was enlightening, that it really gave a good foundation to explaining why and how the Old and New Testaments were corrupted and why they were not the Torah and the Injil. A lot of people seem to like that, and it has benefited hundreds, if not thousands, of people, given the view count, especially with the
there's a misunderstanding that, I mean, I think that your argument, and this is a lot of the du'at now, the people that are debating Christians now, are shifting the argument this way. From Muhammad in the Bible, there's an assumption there that then we don't believe that the book is corrupted, that if some people are just looking and trying to find the Prophet ﷺ in the Bible itself, within the Old and New Testament, that then we consider this book to be correct. And then people like, David Wood and others, that they present the argument, which is that nobody can change Allah's word, and they try to superimpose that over the Bible. So then they make this insinuation that then the Bible is not corrupted, and that we can use it. And your debate itself just throws a monkey wrench into that whole idea, as many of the du'at themselves are starting to do now, which I think is very, very important. It's setting the ground rules. It's clarifying the ground rules that we left vague before. We clarified it before, but since we didn't go into so much depth into it, other debaters, Christian apologists, took advantage of that vagueness, I think personally, and then used it to make these false assumptions, So,
well, exactly as you say, I completely agree with it. It's a misassumption of what the Quran teaches. And I've heard some Christians say, well, you're only now saying this argument. You've never said this before. But as Muslims, we've literally always said this. I believe the Khalifa, Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, may Allah be pleased with him, in a writing to, I think, a Christian king. It could be a king. Forgot the name who he was writing to. I think it could be Leo III. I could be incorrect. But his letter to the Christian king specifically mentions that their scriptures are corrupted. And this is from within the first 3 centuries of Islam. I believe towards the end of the first century. I could be mistaken there. So towards the end of the first century, you actually have the Khalifa mentioning to a Christian king, hey, your scriptures are corrupted, right?
Yeah.
So obviously that's not what we believed. We didn't believe that the that the Old Testament and New Testament are the words from God. And we have evidence of that from the Khalifa, right? So I'm probably saying that word so much, I'm going to end up on a watch list now, Zobala and Dhalik. But the point
All
being,
right, so then let's then shift the topic a little bit. So,
hold
all
on,
right.
let me just wrap up really quickly. Which the point being, this isn't a new argument. You can trace it back to Umar ibn Abdul Aziz. It's not something we've developed. It's not something that we've changed. What we are doing now is being more vocal about what we believe. I mean, this is something I had to contend with Muslims with, right? Some Muslims, I'm not saying all, I'm saying some Muslims believe when that verse in the Quran says that Allah will protect His zikr, His Quran, that it means that nobody can make a mistake on the page and nobody could write something into it. If I took a pen right now, I could write anything I wanted into my Quran. Anything. I could legitimately make a mistake, right?
Yeah.
And that has happened to hundreds of people. The difference between us and the Christian scriptures, the Old and New Testament, is that when we've made a mistake in writing the Quran, we understand it to be a mistake. It doesn't become a legitimate competitor to the normal tradition of the text. So Abu Ayyub, and wherever he is, you probably in, as Donald Trump would say, Nambia or something. I'll make up a country. You're in Nambia, and you make a error in writing down the Quran from someone's recitation. Just because you've made that mistake does not mean all the Qurans in the world magically become corrupted, right? All the copies of the Quran, right?
Yeah.
That's not what happens. And you recognize that as a mistake, full stop. The Quran has not changed. But when it comes to the Old and New Testaments, legitimately any variant is a potential competitor for the text that they believe in. And that is why they have so many textual variants. They don't have a line of transmission. They don't have authoritative texts and identities that they can rely on. Any and all variants are equal in competition with each other. And we simply don't have that same standard of level. We have a higher level of understanding of scripture, while they have a lower level, figuratively speaking, when it comes to accepting any and all variants.
Yeah. I mean, and it's one of those childish arguments that it's just, it's easily refutable. It's a straw man argument just in its basis, in the core of it.
Well, the horrible thing about it is that Christians think it's an intelligent argument. And here's the thing. If you make that argument with a Muslim, most Muslims will look at you and think that something is wrong with you, right? They're not going to think, oh my God, this is a world-shattering argument. My entire worldview has collapsed.
Yeah.
They're going to look at you like something is wrong with you, right? I mean, I believe you even responded to James White on this argument recently. And as far as I'm aware, you're not having an existential crisis and doubt in your faith or anything like that, right?
Well, we gotta let the text speak for itself, and look at it in totality, like he says. But yeah, I mean, it's easily refutable. It's a straw man argument. I remember Dawkins once, he was talking about the ayat in the Quran where the fresh water and the salt water doesn't mix. And his response to it was, well, I can get you a glass of water right now and put salt water and fresh water and mix it, right? And in front of you. So he thought that we're so stupid that we think that fresh water and
literally
and salt water can't literally mix. And that's what you were just laying out as well. Like, you can't corrupt any text at all of the Quran. And basically that would then, if all you would need to do then is just sit down in front of the person and then write on the Quran and close the book, and you've just proven that version or his interpretation of the ayat's wrong.
I've actually wanted to do that to a Christian, like get a copy of the Quran and on the front, not the inside the front cover, write my name. This is the property of Ijaz Ahmad. And then when they tell me you can't change anything, I'll open it. I just wrote my name in the front cover. Right, that doesn't mean the text has changed, right? But they don't seem to get that. There was something though that I wanted to mention, right? Which is that there's this principle. I'm going to get a bit confusing and technical here, but I think I'll wrap up after this point, inshallah. I'm not sure, but there's this principle in New Testament textual criticism that the shorter reading, the shorter variant is the more correct one. Meaning that when some Christian scribes came across difficult to understand verses, they would add to the verse to make it clearer. That's a common concept. You find it literally everywhere. You find it in John chapter 9, verses 38 to 39, 1 John 5, 7, Mark 16, verses 9 to 20, the entirety of John chapter 21. You find it all over the New Testament, basically. They found something confusing, or they wanted to emphasize something, or they wanted to make something clearer, they would add to the text. And so let's just compare this with the Quran here. Brother Abu Ayyub, you know what the muqatta'at are. For example, in Surah Al-Baqarah, it's the very first ayah, which is Alif, Lam, Mim, right? It's just 3 letters that we don't ascribe meaning to. Generally, there's no ascription of meaning there. And so technically speaking, if we were like the Christians, then the Muslims who were, transcribing the Quran, writing it down, why didn't they change the muqatta'at, like Alif, Lam, Mim? Why didn't they change that to mean something? If you look at all of the qira'at, they're exactly the same 3 letters, Alif, Lam, and Mim. It's not any different letters or anything. So the question, I've been doing some research, I've been looking at it. Why is it so common for New Testament scribes to want to change difficult to understand verses, or maybe verses that they themselves didn't understand, to suit their beliefs or to suit their interpretation, but for something so plainly difficult like 3 letters, where you would naturally have the motivation to ascribe meaning to them? Why didn't the Muslim scribes find the motivation to change it?
Yeah.
To me, that simply points out the drastic difference between the New Testament and the Quran. Clearly here, Inna nahnu nazzalna dhikra wa inna lahu lahafizun is playing out in front of us, and I don't think our Christian friends understand that, just from a comparative perspective. And I hope and pray that Christian apologists, like respectable Christian apologists, would actually do a bit more research in that area, inshallah, and they can see that there's a gigantic gulf. I don't know how to express this, but there's such a significant difference between the way that the Quran has been preserved and the way that the New Testament hasn't. I simply cannot be convinced of it at all.
Yeah, that's an interesting topic. That the viewpoint of how the beginning actual letters in the Quran, that they weren't changed and they weren't even exploited because we've had heretical groups as well. And a lot of the changing as well in the Bible, in the New Testament, were in response to the heretical groups around. So it's interesting and we even faced the Batiniya, the groups that were actually trying to interpret the Quran to their own meanings, but yet nevertheless, we don't find that they were exploiting this, nor was the response from the Muslim community to try to come and change the meaning of this. We just said, Khalas, these are letters where we do not know, and it's sufficient for us because we're just going to copy verbatim what we know from our forefathers, having it, handed down in the chain of narration without adding or subtracting to it. So,
what's interesting here is that Christians like to make the argument that Uthman, may Allah be pleased with him, he took away things from the Quran and added what he wanted. The question is, if he had the opportunity to write the Quran for himself, why would he leave those verses in that have no meaning, that we can understand? Why would he leave those 3 letters in for more than one surah, actually? So just think about it. If he was going to write the Quran for himself, I'm not saying that's what he did, but let's take the Christian argument here seriously. Why would he put in verses that have no apparent meaning to us, right? That's the last thing you want to do, right? And if he had the ability to change it, let's say it was there before, and he did have the ability, or his team had the ability, or the Muslims had the ability to change it, then surely they would have, as is demonstrated by the New Testament. When the scribes had the ability to change something, they did. So what is the difference with the Quran? Why didn't they change it? Logically speaking, if you don't understand something, you assume there's an error, you assume there's a mistake, you assume there's a misunderstanding, so you naturally want to correct it. So what has kept 1.66 billion Muslims plus from changing those ayat with the muqatta'at? I don't know, but I think it's Surah 15 verse 9. I could be wrong, but that's what I think.
Yeah. All right. So now, just to shift the topic a little bit. So after this debate, we just apologetics in general. I'd just like to get your opinion about it, and what you view. What's the future of apologetics now? What recommendations you give to us, and some people, some Christians, they have some criticisms towards the Muslim circles, because we're actually progressing a lot in our apologetics, a lot more than 10 years ago. I've seen. I'm actually very happy and impressed with the way that we're moving and progressing in this field. And inshallah, in the future, we're going to be even progressing more. So they're thinking that some of them are claiming that Christian apologists are claiming that Muslims are sitting around and they're trying to do character assassinations of people, and that that basically all our apologetics is just trolling. I know I don't do that personally. I try not to, at least. But sometimes there's some things that Christians bring forward, especially known Christians that are in apologetics, that sometimes it's just so ridiculous that you have to brush it off in a comedic way, in a humorous way, because it's so ridiculous. So, but generally, I try my best to follow this methodology of trying to be respectful, trying to be scholarly. So what about you and your buddy Yahya? What do you think what do you guys have planned? How would you interpret your approaches towards Christians, and why do you take that approach? And what would be your answer to people's criticisms of your approach?
Okay, not necessarily my approach, but I've seen some people criticize Brother Yahya, not Muslims, by the way, but Christians. I've seen a lot of comments on his videos and on social media saying that Yahya must sit down all day long looking for bad news to publish about Christians. But Yahya Snow, I know Yahya Snow. If it's one thing he sits down to do and to make fun of people for, it's football. Right, that's his one thing. I also do the same thing. I sit down, watch a match, and I make fun of him later in the day. But this is a general claim I've seen. I've seen people make this about Abdullah Andalusi. People make this claim about Bassam Zawadi. I believe even Sam Shamoun referred to Bassam Zawadi as doing the same thing, same as brother Sami Zatari. This is a common argument that Muslims just want to correct assassinate Christians because we don't have any meaningful way of dealing with their arguments. And I think that's just not the case. We have honestly and seriously sat down, deconstructed and analyzed almost all of their arguments. And there's no new arguments being put out today. I'll give you an example. You watch a David Wood video. It's the same thing that he was saying 10 years ago. You watch a Sam Shamoun blog on whatever WordPress website he's on now, because he's no longer affiliated with any major apologetics networks. Nothing new. They're just copy-pasting articles that they did from 10 years ago. There's literally nothing new from their camp. I watched Dr. James White interact with your comment. I watched your response to him. And I think even in that response you did to him, you mentioned it's not something new that they're bringing. It's literally the same interpretation from hundreds and hundreds of years ago. So there is nothing new from the Christian side that we have not been unable to deal with. I think we've effectively and efficiently refuted most, if not all, of the argumentation. And I'm not saying this to be overconfident or to put on a facade. I honestly sit down as I look at the state of apologetics today, and I just don't see any meaningful interaction with what us Muslims are saying. Instead, what I see is people saying that Muslims should sit down all day long wanting to criticize Christian apologists. But I'll give you an example. So on this podcast, we did speak about Nabil Qureshi when he got sick. We spoke about him when he passed away. And we've been generally very respectful. But I'll let people know a secret, right? And maybe, inshallah, this could be the title of the podcast. I don't know how this might sound, but the Nabil Qureshi sex scandal you haven't heard of, right? That sounds awful, yeah? Really awful. And
let me clickbait. If we wanted to get views, that would get
yeah, well, we can take the
views.
We could borrow the tactics from David Wood, something really, really clickbaity. But I think it could have been a year or 2 years ago before Nabil got sick. A couple of Muslim apologists got a message in their inbox that a female, so this was before the hashtag MeToo trend. This was before people were being exposed as pedophiles and rapists and all of this drama. So this was pretty before any of these things. And this female Facebook profile inboxed a bunch of Muslims, especially Muslim apologists, and mentioned that Nabil Qureshi assaulted her in one form or the other. I'm not going to get into the specifics here. And this person would occasionally message us repeatedly to ask us when are we going to go public with this information. So typically as Muslims, some Christians believe that we sit down and we wait for bad news about Christian apologists. And if that were true, then we ask them, did you see any Muslim apologists publish this information about Nabil Qureshi?
Yeah.
Not a single person did it, right?
Yeah.
And people make fun of Yahya Snow and say, well, he published anything. Did Yahya Snow publish it? No, he didn't, right? So why didn't we publish anything? On my behalf, I could say that Muslims don't sit down all day long looking to publish information about Christian apologists. What we look to do is, if they've done something literally illegally that is harmful to people around them, then we will make that public. No doubt about that. If they've harmed people, we'll let that be made public. Because these people, they're given authority in Christian circles. But if they're molesters, if they're rapists, if they're people who assault people that they have power over, then that does need to be known, right? But when it came to Nabil Qureshi, I honestly did a quick search. I couldn't verify any of the information. And if I was dishonest, say that I was like Sam Shamoun or something, or if I was Jonathan McClatchy, the first thing I would do is publish that information online. But up to now, I think this is the first public disclosure of this information, right? We simply didn't do that because it was simply untrue. And we don't have any motivations to character assassinate anyone. For example, your friend, quote unquote, Jonathan McClatchy, uploaded a picture of me, unverified picture. He even, before that, he made a false claim about Brother Mansour, saying that he made a girl cry in Hyde Park, Speaker's Corner. And he was severely chastised for that, right? And he didn't apologize publicly, by the way, for his what he claimed was a mistake on his behalf. So Jay Smith, for example, he came out with a conspiracy theory that Muslims were stopping ham from being sold in Harrods in London. And then he later had to apologize and say it was hyperbole. What you find over and over again, I mentioned projection earlier. So Christians say that Muslims sit down and look at ways to character assassinate them all day long. But we're not the ones publishing scandals or publishing fake images or fake statuses. We're the ones that don't have to apologize for these things. That's what the Christians have been doing. And that's something that does need to be noted. I'll give another example here really quickly. All I need to say is this. If we are evil as they think we are, then that Nabil Qureshi story should have been everywhere. On the other hand, you have scandals like the Ravi Zacharias story, which I personally knew about months in advance. Steve Bowman, who is the friendly banjo atheist, he received court documents. He received a testimony from the lady that was involved with Ravi Zacharias. And when I look at the Christian apologists today, none of them have mentioned anything about Ravi. Yet in the New Testament, Paul's letters specifically, he specifically warns about even sharing company with people accused of sexual immorality. Yet you look at, let's call them out by name, Dr. Andy Bannister. Has he refuted or chastised Ravi Zacharias? No. David Wood? No. Has James White? No. Has any of these Christians? Has Pulpits and Pen? Pulpits and Pen, who is criticized a lot by James White, actually did chastise Ravi quite a bit for that scandal. But even then, they didn't go so far as, carrying out what Paul says in the New Testament, disassociating with people accused of sexual immorality. And what I've actually seen is, again, information has been sent to me. I've been included in some chain emails with Christian apologists. They are and Christian scholars. They don't want to touch the subject. They say they don't want to chastise their brother publicly. They don't want to condemn him or rebuke him publicly for what he has done. They just want him to settle the issue by himself. But that's not what the New Testament says to do. It says to chastise these people, rebuke them, disassociate from them. Right? Sexual immorality is actually a big theme of the Pauline letters in the New Testament. Yeah. So at the end of the day, us as Muslims, I think we're doing our job quite well. And it's the Christian community, specifically the Christian apologetics community, that needs to, buck up, get in shape, and be consistent with their theology.
Yeah. I mean, just it's the example that you're putting forward of us pointing out to the immorality of Christianity, that this is actually, number one, this, I believe personally, that this is in response to their methodology, because most of Christian apologetics against Islam, they're trying to claim that they have better morality than us, and then therefore that's why then they bring these, whatever arguments they bring forward. It's shaped around that Islam it can't conform to the 21st century because of, this is part of their premise.
Yep.
So naturally, we're going to respond in the same to point out either the similarities in our theology and faith, even if it's negated and the law isn't passed or being applied today, that your God actually applied that previously. So how do you call us evil and immoral if your God permitted it? Or actions that are taking place today in the world, in third world countries that haven't progressed, and then we find Christians constantly posting articles and news events of these things happening. You find Muslims having to go and they become pseudo-historians and having to go and show that actually in Christian history, we find that things are a lot worse, and the application is a lot worse. That was, prime example is my, the Origins of Terrorism series. Before I even talked about Islam myself, I had to break the moral high ground. I actually even call that breaking the moral high ground and exposing the propaganda war machine. And that's because I know from the get-go, before even the conversation begins, that there's a prejudice being brought in, that there's a worldview, number one, that they're morally superior to us. So how can we have a really fruitful conversation when there's already, external things, external viewpoints and prejudices being brought into the conversation? And so I think, and they might criticize, well, then you stop for a while, and then maybe, you should hope that we stop. Actually, everybody knows that whoever is the majority and has the most power in any dynamic, in any situation, that it's upon them to set the example first. So, for example, if you wanted to talk about racism, right, against blacks and whites, of course there is black people that are racist against white people. But we don't sit there and point this out and criticize it because, number one, it's very less, and number two, they are a minority in the situation. They have less power. So it's upon the person that has the more power to actually set the example. And this is how everybody views this. So the Christian community themselves, they need to go and they need to stop the Pamela Gellers that are, posting stories, even lies, fake news, the Breitbarts, and all these things. And then, the Muslim sex groomers and all these stories, when they're not being fair. And once they do that, then inshallah, then you can expect that then Muslims will follow suit and stop trying to employ their methodology and their actions and their tactics against them. Because actually, in reality, it's Muslims they are responding to the tactics that you're doing. It's not that we set the example.
Well, Abu Ayyub, let me ask you a question, right?
Yeah.
Do Muslims have degree programs specific to doing apologetics?
Nope.
Do Muslims have entire colleges dedicated to doing apologetics?
Nope.
Do we have major funding? Are we funded by wealthy donors to do apologetics?
Nope.
But the Christians are. So not only do they have the funding and the resources, the manpower, and some would say the information that they need to do it, they just don't have the moral standards to do so properly. What you'll realize is, and I've been on a couple of Facebook profiles of Christian apologists, and it's about Islam. It's about immigrants and Islam. It's about third world countries and Islam. Personally, I think that they can't coherently deal with the ideologies of Islam, and so instead of teaching about their own faith, they make it about Islam. It's easier to attack something than rather than to be introspective about your own faith. I mean, look at this, for example. Let's look at Jonathan McClatchy. He's doing his PhD in biology, right? I mean, forgive that the guy can't discriminate between a girl and a woman. I mean, I forgive him for that. Maybe he needs to get a refund on that degree. But the point is, his degree is in biology, yet he wants to debate Muslims. That doesn't make sense, right? He has no history debating Muslims, nothing like that. Yet his degree also has nothing to it. His degree is specifically geared towards refuting atheists and evolutionists, but that just does not seem to be the case. You look at someone like David Wood. He did a degree in philosophy. So who is he poised to refute responsibly? Atheists. Who is he responding to? Muslims. You go and answer in Muslims, and he forbids and he bans Christians from discussing their own theology. I have screenshots of him letting people know that he's actually agnostic on serious issues like the nature of God, who is saved and how they're saved. Yet they want to speak about Islam. So at the end of the day, we have less resources, less manpower. We have less organization, yet we honestly seem to be doing a significantly better job than they are. We're not using arguments from hundreds of years ago, right? We're using textual criticism, we're using the philosophy of religion, we're using logic, we're using all of the modern methodologies, and we're excelling at them, and we're leaving behind the apologetics of the 70s, 80s, and 90s behind us. We're moving on. And so we ask our Christian brothers and sisters to actually gird themselves up by their bootstraps, pull themselves up by their bootstraps, and match us. Don't fall behind with the polemics and the character assassination, the insults. We have enough Pamela Gellers, we have enough Robert Spencers. What we need are Christian apologists with dignity, respect, and hopefully honesty, God willing.
Yeah, God willing. And enough with the conspiracy theories as well, like Petra and all this stuff. I mean, I hate to say this, but I just heard James White, I think in September, he said he actually gave the lecture, I think it's in number 42 of his church history, or maybe 41, where he actually said that he still thinks it's a compelling argument. So
well, one of the, what's interesting about that is that I have one question to ask these people who come with this theory. The reason that they come with this theory is that they say that the Quran does not describe the geography of Makkah in detail. Yeah. Okay, why does the Quran have to do that? You're putting a requirement there that that the Quran is not a book about geography. The Quran is not a book, it's not a bios, so it's not going to contain specific local information that you're looking for, right? It's not about solely the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. It's a book that goes between different time frames, different eras, different peoples, different cultures, and so you can't expect it to be an encyclopedia about the geography of Makkah al-Mukarramah, right? You can't have that expectation, but the Christians...
It's more difficult to see the Christians before, especially in Najran, they would pray towards the east. And that was just the way that they pray towards the east. It's easy when the sun's rising and setting, saying, okay, that's the east. But where you're going and trying to find where Mecca is, that's a specific area. So depending on where you're at, it's going to be a different area. If you're to the west of Mecca, then you have to pray south east. Right? If you're to the east, you have to pray southwest, or so on and so forth. If you're in the north, so it's more difficult. So and we have already in our fiqh, it's called jurisprudence, that we are permitted, if we don't know the way of Mecca, we pray whichever direction, we pray as close as we can to it.
Exactly, and in fact, I believe there's in some madhab, there's the concept where if you don't specifically know where the Qibla is, you can have 180 degrees of error on it. So you have a plane and you can have up to 180 degrees on either side of not specifically pointing towards it. And guess what? Almost every single mosque that Dan Gibson looks at is within that level of error. I believe it's even down to a couple of degrees actually. So he's looking for precision at a time when there wasn't going to be specific precision. And what I always ask people is this: let's assume that they did change the Qibla. Let's assume that it was Petra and then it became Makkah. Okay, let's assume that did happen. For all of the people making Hajj, right? 1 year they show up at Petra and they see nothing, right? And then how do they know? Are they told by some guy, hey guys, all of you hundreds, maybe thousands of people, keep this quiet. We change it to like 100 miles the other direction. Just go along with it. And somehow nobody has managed to write this down or to mention it. Or there's not even a specific group of Muslims in history that has decided, no, we're staying with the original one. Let it be Petra. You don't even have that, right? You have people in the Ridda Wars right after the Prophet, peace be upon him, passed away, right? You had that. So you had a war for that, but no one decided to go to war for the Qibla changing. Does that make sense to you? It does not make sense to me. So a poor man from, say, China or Africa or the Caucasus in northeastern Europe, they travel all the way to Petra. They're told that the Qibla changes. And they decide, okay, I'll just go 1,000 miles further and go to South and go to the Hijaz, and I'll meet you guys there, right?
Oh,
So
well, I mean, what happened was, okay, this is how it actually, I think this is how it played out. Robert Spencer wrote his book, Did Muhammad Exist? And he wrote that book. He didn't write it that he did years of research and then came to this conclusion. He wrote it a year later after Did Jesus Exist book come out. So he did a response to that. And that's what a lot of the Christians do sometimes. They repackage atheist arguments against their faith and use it against Islam. So when that book came out, more than likely Robert Spencer was like, oh, maybe I can do one about Muhammad. So I saw him. And then the Petra issue, I guess, is written in that book. But the thing is, whenever you look in history, Petra, the Nabateans, this
Nabateans.
this
Yeah.
community of people, it's a vague community. They don't know a lot. There's a hole in that history there. So that
Oh
because
yeah,
there's a
I
hole
agree.
there, if you look at the descriptions of it, they're like, oh, that's a place that we can fill in the blanks and say, well, this could have been where the Muslim community started.
But you, that's why a lot of atheists refer to Christianity as the religion of the God of the gaps, right?
Yeah.
But wasn't it Bill O'Reilly said that the one that said that the tide comes in and the time goes out?
Yeah.
You don't know how that happens, right? So that's what the Qibla argument comes down to. The Qibla goes in, the Qibla comes out. You don't know how that happens, right?
So it's and James White, okay, in his lecture that I was listening to for another issue, he said, yeah, usually I don't like these arguments. He says I try to argue according to what they believe, so I'm not going to come with conspiracies. But then he shows his own bias. He's like, but it's actually compelling. So it's they
Well,
like it. You know what I mean? It's kind
I
of
actually,
like it's tabloid apologetics. Where something is starting in that direction, and they're like, "Ooh, well, we got this," and it's selective, and it's selective as well.
let me say this, brother Abu Ayyub. There's this movie by Monty Python about Jesus. I forgot the name of it, right? And it's basically a parody of someone living at the same time as Jesus and being mistaken for Jesus. And I found that movie to be quite compelling, so I guess it must be true, If I was thinking like those guys, I would look at that movie as a biography, not as a parody, right? So
Yeah.
let's just leave it as that. You and I, and the Muslim community in general, has higher standards. I mean, if Muslims wanted to, be as speculative as Christians, we could simply say that Jesus never existed, and the Jesus of the Quran is an illusion, it's allegory, it's not, literal. We could go in that route if we were vindictive, if we didn't want to be consistent, if all we wanted to do was refute another faith. But we have higher standards. We don't go into speculation. And I mentioned that in my debate with my dialogue with Alex. I actually told him at one point, in my religion, we don't make assumptions, we don't presume, right? We need to have evidences for what we believe in. Dalail, we need to have literal, actual evidences for what we believe and accept. So that's the distinction here. Remember, you might find this ridiculous, but there's actually the Journal of Evangelical Speculative Theology. I believe that spells the word jest, J-E-S-T, right?
Mhm.
But no, in Christian theology, there is the area of speculative theology. So this comes, this means of speculating historically about Islam comes from their own theological studies, where they are allowed to speculate about it. And it's not just liberals, quote unquote, that do that. It's also really conservative evangelicals. So I
Yeah, I mean,
think it's
if you're doing it from a scholarly approach and it being a neutral historian, then you have to approach it that way. But if you're doing it as a conspiracy theorist and you're trying to make the conclusion and you're demanding that is the conclusion 100%, you have a bias then. You're bringing in your own biases to the argument, which isn't fair. I mean, there's many, many books out there about Christianity that's conspiratorial. James White always mentions these. There's a new book that came out called Caesar's Messiah by Joseph Atwill that actually says that the Flavians, that the Roman government actually was the one that created Christianity to quell Judaism. And if we were to follow this methodology, we could easily copy and paste this book and use it in apologetics and make this argument.
but we have standards, so
Yeah.
we don't do that.
So that's the approach. If you're going to do that, and people like Robert Spencer, that was on ABN Network, and was side by side with James and working in the same place, beforehand. You guys are working off of one another, and yet you're not following the same standards. So. Alhamdulillah. At the very least, I'm glad that we are progressing, and I'm glad that you had the chance to put forward your arguments in the debate recently, Ijaz. So I think with that, we're going to close and hope that we can do another podcast soon. Is there anything else you want to add before we close on this podcast?
Yeah, I know that you have some upcoming videos to be published soon. I would encourage folks to check out your dialogue with Brother John Fontaine. I think that was a really beneficial video. And to check out my dialogue with Alex Karimli as well. And I both believe that we have a lot more projects coming out soon, God willing. And I hope that, the people check them out.
Yeah, it was a pleasure, Ijaz. Thank you very much.
Assalamu alaikum, Brother Abu Ayyub.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.